Hello, this will be the last video on the Waffen in a while, just because there's not too much else to talk about on this tank. Anyway, for the BZ-176 and the MBT-B, Wargaming hasn't given press accounts these tanks yet, so there's no content on these two yet. However, for the BZ, it's just a 2-shot auto-loading tank with an 8-second intraclip and 560 alpha per shell. Its armor's not great, its mobility's not great, however its gun is pretty interesting. MBT-B is basically like a tier 9 Rhinoceronte with a bit more hull armor but a slightly worse turret, 4-second intraclip with 390 alpha on an auto-reloading gun, which has the exact same reload on both shells. MBT-B is definitely the better tank. It's a very good, very strong vehicle. BZ is a bit more interesting to play though. I'd say MBT-B is rather sort of boring in its gameplay, however it's undeniable it's a very good tank. Anyway, that's not what this is about. Let's talk about why the Waffenträger is a bit of a problem sometimes. So, the reason I've titled the video as it is because it is true, the Waffenträger will be a problem in certain battles. And the reason for this is because of how it's been balanced. If you think about how Wargaming generally balances tanks in tier 10, the way they are balanced is, well, if we take a look at tank destroyers in tier 10, you'll see there's a sort of general rule around balancing, which is they generally have a pretty good chance to deal with most situations. For example, all tanks with single shot guns have consistent DPM with good alpha to be able to deal with the enemies in front of them without having to be out of the fight for too long. Or they've also got some good armor, or sometimes in exchange for armor they've got good mobility and a relatively okay camo rating for some vehicles. However, the Waffenträger breaks out of this, and you can see that especially when you compare it to the FE 4005. So if you compare these two tanks in particular, the FV noticeably has a much faster reload. However, its gun is a lot less accurate for its alpha damage for both guns compared to the Waffenträger. While yes, the FV has less alpha damage, relative to how much damage it does, its accuracy isn't at all impressive. In fact, it's pretty derpy for how much damage it does. So you can see that it exchanges some accuracy to be able to be more consistent on DPM, and this tank's DPM is actually very good at, I believe, 3,300. Yes, that is great DPM, especially considering this tank has a 4-shell autoloader with good alpha damage. It only does, I believe, 60 to 70 less damage depending on which gun the Waffenträger is mounting. So that just shows you how the Waffenträger has been balanced. Rather than spreading its stats out over the vehicle, it has basically nothing, well, very little in terms of armor, very little, well, its mobility isn't impressive, it's okay, but it's not like a Grilla 15, which is pretty quick, and outside of 7 seconds of unloading damage, it hasn't got the okay magazine reload to be able to be consistent to respond to situations. It's very much reliant on that 7 seconds where it is broken in damage output. And that is why this tank is going to be a problem in a few battles, and I'll show that today in this video. The reason being, if you can get rid of the 30-second reload, this tank is just outright broken, because what's holding you back other than the 30-second reload? That 30-second reload is the time when enemies can push you, when they can damage you, when you can't fight back, when you can't do anything to the enemy team. But if you can mitigate that, if you can get rid of that 30-second reload where enemies put pressure on you, then this tank is unstoppable in terms of how much damage it can do, really. And of course, with a bit of luck, you get out all your shots on reload. It does allow you to do a lot of damage, and that's the problem with the Waffenträger. It just has to have a battle like that, where enemies aren't pressuring it, where it can get damage out, and then it's going to be pulling out massive damage games. It's only a matter of time before 9, 10k damage, maybe even 11k damage battles happen from the Waffenträger, just because if it can mitigate its reload, what's stopping it from just doing that amount of damage? Not too much, really. So let's get into the replay I have for this tank. Just sort of as evidence of my point, I've played 11 battles on this tank on the EU server, and I think around 15 or 20 on the Asia server on this tank. So it's not been all that many battles before I've managed to pull out a game where I've done really rather high, unusually high amounts of damage in this vehicle. And I'll say I'm not the type of player who pulls out 7, 8k, 9k damage games often. In fact, for my personal account, I've only gotten maybe 4 or 5 battles which have been 6.5 to 7.5k damage. So this one is within that range. And it's only been 20 or 30 battles I've played this tank, and I've already been able to pull out a game which has significant amounts of damage. And again, that's just the point on this tank. If it gets a bit lucky, if it can mitigate its reload and only be catching out enemies while it is fully loaded, then it's going to pull out these games, well, I expect, fairly decently often compared to other tanks, which I would feel like it would be a less common occurrence just because of how they deal damage. For this one, notice the Progetto on full hit points has now gone down to 142. That's not the best trade by me, but you'll see there just what this tank does. 7 seconds, that Progetto is down to less than a one-shot. It's down to a one-shot for a tank with 160 alpha, which you can do at tier 6. So yeah, you can see that when the damage goes like that, then it does stack up fairly quickly. And you'll see here, I'm completely out of the way of the enemies. I'm far away from them. I'm facing no pressure of being damaged until I push up here, and I do take a shot because of that, but luckily connecting the first one, luckily connecting the second one, and then the third one as well, and the E100 doesn't manage to hit me back. So 2 minutes in, I've done almost 3,500 damage, facing no pressure from being shot at by enemies. Other than that, not the greatest trade in with the Progetto, and of course pushing forward to get shot by the E5. But notice, I could have avoided that damage. I just deliberately chose to push the E5, and I deliberately chose to sit out in front of a Progetto. That was fully my fault. But here, seeing the VK losing his whole tank to that 183, I decide I'm not going to try and support that side, and I'll go towards A, since there's 3 one-shots, one of them going down there. But you'll notice my positioning here. Notice how far away the enemies are from me. Yes, so far I've only managed to get out 2 magazines, but it's worked out quite well. Yes, I did trade damage for those magazines, but again, I've been the one who's been making that push to be shot for that damage. That was fully my fault. It wasn't the enemies pushing me, it was me making that mistake of being shot. That was my fault. But again, I'm under no pressure. Here I'm able to take my full time to reload and to be at full damage dealing capacity. So there, unfortunately, I didn't want to risk a shot on the 183. I probably should have, honestly, because I missed this shot on the FV, and that is a game-winning shot there. So it's unfortunate I did miss. You'll see that soon. But now, again, I'm just too far from the enemies for them to really push me easily. And I'm able to fully reload my magazine. I'm not being pressured by them to be, well, killed. So I'm able to sit here for 30 seconds and get my 3 shells back. And again, at this point, I'm only up to, I believe, 4,000 damage, because one of the shots was a blind shot, and that doesn't show up with the in-game counter. But here the FV-4005 is spotted, so I'm going to go use HE on him because I could 3-shot him. If I get very lucky I could 2-shot him. But here we go. He's not using a spool liner, which is odd. He has the 5k rating camo. But I do put in 2 nice shots into his tank. I'm not going to reload yet because I am actually under pressure from these 2 tanks if I do reload. The 183 does push, which is pretty nice for me. I believe I just went unspotted in the moment where he pushes, and that push helped conceal me. But now this FV doesn't seem to know that I have an immensely long reload and I only have 3 shells, so he's not pushing me. Notice, this is the one situation in this battle where I have been under reload pressure of the enemy. All other situations in this battle, I had full time to reload very easily, and I got lucky here that the FV didn't decide to push. Again, lucky, the E100 missed me, but here I make a mistake. I know the FV is probably going to push, and he does, and I just get tunnel vision and I go for the damage on the E100. I should have known better, but that was my fault. That game was definitely winnable, and again, it's proof. This tank just needs a little bit of luck. If you're able to, well, get a few misses from the enemies, and then you're able to fully reload your magazine, mitigate this tank's major weakness, which is that reload, and maximize on this tank's strength, which is its 7 seconds of being completely broken, unloading damage, then huge damage will happen. And I expect it's not going to be too long before we see very high damage battles, like 8, 9, 10k damage from this tank. Of course it's going to take some luck, and maybe it won't happen immediately, but I expect for this tank in particular, it's not going to take too long. Again, I did this 7k damage in just a 20 or 30 battle experience, well, yeah, 20 or 30 battles, and I managed to pull out this 7k. Again, it's an ace, so it makes good credits because of the ace, and then you can see the sort of damage distribution among my team, with me hogging all the damage, because I did manage to use the gun very effectively in that battle, mitigating the reload completely. So yeah, that's the Waffen problem. It could be very dangerous in the battles where it avoids reload pressure from the enemies. However, again, the reason I didn't show that battle in my review is because it's not representative of the Waffenträger. This tank very often gets shut down fairly easily because it has such a long reload and it does face reload pressure from the enemies. However, because of how it's been balanced, if you can just mitigate that one aspect, the long reload of the tank, you will be able to pull out massive damage. And again, it's just going to be a matter of time till we see some great replays. But yeah, thanks for watching. That is the Waffenträger, and that will be it for this tank for the moment.